And a warm greeting to all of you sharing in this particular virtual worship on this that is your Homecoming Sunday. And a welcome to those near and far who are joining in this virtual worship of Homecoming today. So to all of us, grace and peace be upon us from God, who is the creative presence, the compassionate one, and the truth that saves. Rabbi, priest, minister, bartender. Now, that may sound like a really poor rendition of a setup to a joke. And in fact, it is. What makes this particular setup so pathetic? Why does it not connect quite the way a really good joke teller would offer it? Well, one significant word is missing. One that might well connect the silly little example in such a way as to at least draw an even enormous groan from all of you. What if that one word happened to be a three-letter word, A-N-D, and? A rabbi and a priest and a minister walk into a bar, and the bartender says, "Oh no, not you three again." Or maybe not the best of examples and a bit of a stretch, and yet doesn't use of that one word make the joke sound and feel even a little bit more connected? I got to thinking about this curious role of the word "and" from an article that I had read not long ago. Religious News Service was quick to point out upon her selection a month and a half ago that a vice presidential nominee is both biracial and bi-religious. Quoting the article, the junior senator from California who was born in Oakland to a Jamaican immigrant father and an immigrant mother from Asia is both Black and South Asian. She grew up in a home that accommodated both Christian and Hindu religious practices. Black and Asian, Christian and Hindu. In these times, and on a Sunday dedicated to a special kind of homecoming for Community United Church here in Fresno, I would like to suggest it is important to remember the and that is embedded in both our personal lives as well as in the life of the church. That little word that we learn from basic elementary school English grammar lessons, and, is known as a conjunction. And most dictionaries say that a conjunction connects things that are to be taken jointly. Our middle son, Tim, went through undergraduate studies on a music jazz performance scholarship and majored in biology. Upon graduating, he was admitted to the Washington University School of Medicine in St. Louis, where, while completing his medical studies, he would take his saxophone and sit in on open jam sessions in the St. Louis area. Medicine and music. Today, some 25 years later, he continues to practice as a geriatric physical therapist and as a highly regarded professional musician, even bringing most weeks his live music performance into the very care facilities where he treats clients, physically and emotionally. Maybe too often you and I neglect to appreciate how to apply that word "and," this small, modest, connective word. In the cases of Senator Harris and of our son Tim, the "and" acts as a bridge between identities that most people might normally consider distinct, separate, and not necessarily compatible. I find here a fundamental faith message embedded in use of the word "and." 2 years ago, our Interfaith Alliance in Central California spent a day in a retreat, and our retreat facilitator, whom some of you may know, Paul Pierce, suggested that when suggesting matters before us, that we replace the word but with and. For example, instead of saying something like, we need to listen to each other carefully, but with critical discernment. What would happen if that now became, we need to listen to each other's sides and with critical discernment? You get a slight sense of what that connective word now makes possible. Apply that to something like, I want my country to live up to its ideals, but there are important religious values I believe can undergird who we are. Now try saying it this way. I want my country to live up to its ideals, and there are important religious values I believe can undergird who we are. See how this latter frame provides space for a multitude of religiously shared values to be embraced, to be discussed, creating a bridge, not a wall. And do you, as I sometimes do, encounter people who believe that American Christianity is called to be part of a wall-building process? There are many these days openly calling for a Christian America, which is a thinly veiled desire for a white-only, religiously defined nation. This also suggests church membership requires adherence to very specific creeds and codes and particular dogma that proclaim a very narrow Christian superiority over and against other, thus judged lesser, traditions with their prophets and sacred scriptures and teachers. Sacred scriptures such as the Quran or the Torah and others are not credited with holding any divinely inspired revelations and truths of God's ethical, moral, or creative imagination. Here, bridge is not the infrastructure associated in this narrow Christian political or social culture. Wall, fortress, moat, yes. Bridge, not really. With no and allowed to be a connective tissue for discussing shared practice of faith and politics, culture and identity. Commentators have long debated Paul's primary purpose in composing the book of Romans, largely because of its being such a long and theologically weighted piece, and to a church community that he did not found and had yet not visited. I'll leave those debates to others and to another time, except to note that a key issue for Paul is the place of Jews and Gentiles before God in light of the saving intentions of Jesus as the Christ. The portion read from this letter to the Romans this morning represented a very practical matter relevant to this particular Roman community, and by extension, not exclusively to them. Paul was expecting to be visiting Rome soon, and when he could not get there, it would be only once he had arrived, he would be seeking their support for a first century equivalent to a Kickstarter campaign. He was wanting to help fund his proposed missionary travels to Spain, as he indicates in the following chapter. He speaks of being helped there on my journey by you. Paul is referring to support by way of money, food, travel arrangements, and so forth. Paul's interest is, in the words of the Jewish scholar Eli Lazorkin Eisenberg in his book, The Jewish Apostle Paul, to convey that God was no longer to be celebrated as only the God of Israel, and that the arrival of the awaited age that had begun with the resurrection of Jesus now meant that God must now be recognized as the God of the entire created order, the God of Israel, and the God of the nations as well. God justified both the circumcised, code word for Israel, and the uncircumcised, code word for the nations. So the challenge for us in this 20th century filtering that we do is that for generations, Christian preaching and teaching has assumed Paul's world was defined by simple binary realities. Thus, we assume Jew or Gentile, slave or free, male or female, to mean distinctly opposing contrasts in terms of power, influence, acceptability, or rights to inheritance. Paul, in his missionary travels, was finding that both traditional Jews and a wide variety of Gentiles were being drawn together in clusters because of their intrigue over the teachings of this Jesus and the stories of how his miracles transcended once static boundaries. Read carefully, our lectionary passage this morning focuses on two in-house matters, notably the tensions arising among people in this emerging Roman congregation who find themselves on opposing sides of two problematic issues. First, whether or not it's appropriate to eat certain foods, hence whether to adhere to traditional Jewish dietary standards and practices, or to allow for local customs of non-Jewish dietary practice. Secondly, were there certain days that deserved greater honor and attention than others? And this is a dual reference to observing traditional Roman public festivals, as well as on which day to faithfully observe Sabbath. At its core, the issues that Paul is identifying here are about each group setting itself over and above the other group, claiming the higher moral ground for its particular practices and opinions. On the one side are the broccoli-loving vegetarians, and are the people who eat almost nothing else. And on the other side are those who eat anything, smoked ribs, shrimp, scampi, with each side sneering judgmentally at the other about their choices and justifications. Similarly, among them were some people who continued to celebrate festival days, many of which were long-established civic Roman holidays, which celebrated local gods. They judge one day to be better than another, while others refuse. And then there was the question as to whether they ought to observe the third day, the day of resurrection, as their Sabbath, or the traditional observance of Sabbath on Friday. Right there, out in the open, we have some of the earliest church-state debates. As if to make the point even sharper, just 2 chapters later, Paul hones in on his concern over brothers and sisters sitting in judgment pertaining to the behavior of one another. He says, "Who are you to pass judgment on servants of another? And why do you pass judgments on your brother or your sister?" The theme is strengthened even further by the verse that closes our morning pericope. "Let us therefore no longer pass judgment on one another, and resolve instead never to put a stumbling block or a hindrance in the way of another." Over the succeeding 2 centuries, leading thinkers of the early Christ-following community attempted to bridge these and other divides within the wider and growingly diverse body by establishing unified creeds or professions of faith. Now, this would have come as a big surprise to the very earliest Christians, those who took up the new faith in the years immediately following what Marcus Borg defines as the post-Easter Jesus. They did adopt a creed, but it wasn't the familiar Apostles' Creed that most Christians know from church history, and which itself didn't come into use until the 4th century. Rather, the first creed was this: "For you are all children of God in the Spirit. There is no Jew or Greek. There is no slave or free. There is no male or female. For you are one in the Spirit." refreshingly recreated in EJ's music this morning that we got to hear. Well, if these particular words that I just recited sound familiar, they come out of Galatians, the 3rd chapter, and is attributed by way of Paul as one of the oldest texts from the New Testament. In his recent book, The Forgotten Creed, biblical scholar Stephen Patterson argues that Paul did not come up with these words simply on his own. Rather, he contends, Paul borrowed that phrase from an even older source, most likely the first Christian baptismal liturgy, which was likely a modification that Jesus applied to the baptismal practice handed him from John the Baptist. For even Paul acknowledges in his letter to the Corinthians that he is simply passing along what has been handed down to him by others, by those who had preceded him. When new followers joined the Jesus movement in those earliest days, the words most likely repeated to those about to be baptized were, "You are all children of God. We are all Greek and Jew, male and female, slave and free, for we are one in the Spirit." And why was that so meaningful and powerful? Well, the ancient world that we know was at least, if not even more so, divided than our own time. It was a society of hierarchies where certain ethnicities were privileged, where people who were free were deemed fully human, and slaves considered as beast-like labor, where men were always superior to women, Roman or not. White Roman privilege long preceded our own recognizable systemic racism and privilege. Bigotry, slavery, and sexism were an efficient coinage of the Roman Empire. And Jesus challenged all of this in his welcoming of sinners, of outcasts, by engaging with Phoenician and Samaritan foreigners, eating with people deemed unclean, and insisting that those who were last in this world would be first in God's kingdom. The earliest believers readily embraced his radical, social, spiritually cogent message, something we know because of a history of so many who were killed by the empire as traitors to a form of what would become a Pax Romana. They were, as Patterson says, committed to giving up old identities falsely acquired on the basis of baseless assumptions, Jew or Greek, slave or free, male or female, and dared to declare themselves to be children of God rather than solely children of the emperor's realm. Thus, the first Christian creed, this long forgotten creed, wasn't exclusively about God. It was about us, who we are, and who matters, and who deserves dignity. The very first creed was a statement of human solidarity. The Jesus movement grew from a community who dared to proclaim that there is no us versus them, and we are all children of God. Concludes Patterson, it was about solidarity, not cultural obliteration. So, this is no normal homecoming Sunday, is it? Environmentalist and Christian layperson Bill McKibben recently published in the New Yorker magazine an article in which he wrote about being cautious and careful as to what we mean when today we say we are wanting things to return to normal. He writes, "The point of church is not just comfort or familiarity. It is, or it should be, coming to grips with the relentless radicalism of Jesus, where faith is now a team sport, solidarity. And what are we going to do about it? That seems the only question," McKibben continues, "as our institutions of all kinds begin to come slowly, fitfully back to life. Now, might we take that to mean that for our churches, our governments, our schools, our businesses, the main goal can't simply be to return to things to normal as we once experienced them? Because in a world that watched how George Floyd and Breonna Taylor died, anything like normal is clearly unjust. In a world that is rapidly warming, and with the acrid smell and orange skies that is a canopy over our west coast, anything like normal is cataclysmically dangerous. And the challenges that our public and private institutions, as they have in the past been willing to mount to confront that kind of injustice and danger, we are now coming to understand how feeble, too sporadic, too easily ignored they have turned out to be in the process of just being routine. You can tell how much work we have to do by the smallness of the steps that such institutions are even now taking. The decision by some companies to pull ads from Facebook for a single month is both highly unusual and remarkably puny. The Washington football team has changed its names. Great, but it took all of this to get there. Certain Christian communities remain indignant that community safeguards is limiting in-house gatherings during this pandemic and does not apply to their self-declared privilege to worship en masse. I believe there may be some truth in thinking that Jesus did not say he would be present only where 200 or 300 or 2,000 or 3,000 are gathered. Even voting this fall will be but a necessary small step in changes that must be made to enable a new kind of normal. So as we come home this morning in our symbolic worship event, this 13th day of September of 2020, the symbolic ritual of entering a new program year for the church, we come as a virtual congregation, connected electronically from a myriad of safe oases, as we gaze at one another from smaller than life screens. And there is yet the hope that God's Spirit and the presence of Jesus' continuing call is one to come home, where that same Spirit can both heal and sustain us, that we can still feel and know each other's joys and sorrows, that there is yet purpose and inspiration to be drawn from this pandemic experience in which we nonetheless discover something precious embedded in a medical and cultural and political virus. The nearly 200,000 deaths attributed to this outrageous COVID virus demands that we draw from our faith's deepest well of lament a care for each death, each household devastated, each life, each small business impacted by this virus, and to embrace by faith the hope that beneath that well is yet an aquifer flowing with replenishing accounts of selflessness, of empathy, of actions that bubble forth to offer an everlasting hope that God's goodness and Christ's presence is yet so very accessible to all God's children. Lament and hope each call us home today, where we begin to shape our new homecoming normal. We are all children of God, you and your neighbor, and immigrants, and believers from other faith traditions, and Democrats, and Republicans, and independents, and. We are all children of God. It is what Jesus preached. It is what Paul shared in his letters, where walls are torn down and bridges built in their stead. And And so may we become architects of hope in a new and bridge-building normal. Amen and amen.